A stranger passing through Loch Dhu leaves behind more questions than answers, drawing Hamish Macbeth into a quiet mystery. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? And if you enjoy settling into these Highland mysteries, subscribe and make this part of your nightly ritual. Only 11% are subscribed while 89% aren't. Your support truly means a lot. The rain had been falling in a thin, dreary sheet since noon, the sort that made the pavements shine and brought out every damp smell from the old stone. Hamish stood beside Patel's shop, leaning over the open bonnet of the police Land Rover as if he was studying something important. He was not. He was only hoping the afternoon would pass without fuss. Lugg sat beside him, tail twitching, glancing up whenever a car splashed round the bend. The Inverness bus came wheezing into the village with a hiss of brakes. Hamish straightened, wishing it were another delivery van. Instead, a thin Englishman stepped down, neat as a pin, carrying a small suitcase and a battered attaché case that looked older than he was. The man surveyed Loch Dhu with a bland, considering expression, the type Hamish had seen on tourists who thought the Highlands should apologise for being damp. Patel came out to sweep rain from the doorstep, though the broom did nothing. The Englishman marched up. "Shop, is it?" he asked. His voice was clipped, the sort that sounded as if it doubted the competence of everyone else. "It's not a theatre," Patel said shortly. "In you go." Hamish watched through the window as the man placed his suitcase carefully against the counter and unfolded a soggy map. Patel's shoulders tightened. That was interesting. Luggs gave a faint whine. A moment later the Englishman stepped aside, holding up a tourist map as if it were a legal document. "Who would know about the abandoned croft up the Loch Road?" he asked. "The one connected with that accident years ago." Hamish felt a flick of irritation. Strangers usually asked about midges or boat hires. "What accident?" he called in, though he already had an idea. The man turned, sharp-eyed. "You're the police?" Hamish nodded. "I'm Colin Farrow, just passing through for a night or two." He said it in a way that suggested he expected the village to be relieved. "I'm interested in local history, particularly road accidents that were never resolved." Patel made a low sound and busied himself with the till. He never liked talk about old business. It kept the customers quiet in the wrong way. Hamish closed the bonnet slowly. He did not enjoy being drawn into conversations when he had planned a peaceful afternoon. "Folk up here dinna keep a catalogue of their disasters," Hamish said. "If you want stories, try the hotel bar." Farrow smiled, thin and amused. "I thought the police might have something more official to offer." Hamish kept his face blank. He had learned that trick early. It stopped people thinking he was slow, only a little. When Farrow finally left for the Tommel Castle Hotel, gossip had already begun. A crofter waiting for bread muttered something about outsiders who poked about in things that were none of their concern. A fisherman claimed he'd heard of a death on that road but couldn't remember details. Patel's niece said she didn't like the look of the man, though she liked even less the way her uncle grew stiff whenever the croft was mentioned. By the time Hamish walked to the Kirk Hall for the tourist brochure meeting, word had spread. Loch Dhu could have powered the whole of Scotland on gossip alone. Inside, damp coats steamed. Mrs. Docherty was arguing about whether the broch on the hill counted as historic or just old stones. Hamish leaned in a corner with a chipped mug of tea, wishing he had stayed in the station with lugs and a peat fire. Then Farrow appeared at the back, holding his folded map like a talisman. He scanned the room until his eyes landed on Hamish. "Some police forces have time to sit, I see," he said loudly. The room went quiet. The tea tasted sour in Hamish's mouth. He felt the warm prickle of embarrassment climb his neck. A few villagers turned, waiting to see if the constable would finally act like one. Hamish forced a laugh. "We're not overrun with crime here, and you're just another nosy tourist, so leave the police work to us." Farrow looked him up and down. "Tourist?" "Aye," Hamish said. "Tourist." Mrs. Docherty pursed her lips as if Hamish had let down the reputation of the entire Highlands. Someone near the biscuits muttered, "Shame if he's police." Hamish drank the rest of his tea, though it tasted like swamp water. When Farrow passed him on the way out, Luggs stiffened and growled low in his throat. Hamish tugged the dog's collar. "Behave," he whispered, though he didn't blame him. There was something off about the man. Too neat, too sharp. The ones who caused trouble rarely looked rough. After the meeting, Hamish walked to the hotel. He told himself it was duty, but he wanted to see where the man settled himself. Inside the bar, the lights were too bright. Tourists hunched over their pints. Mr. Sinclair wiped glasses with the air of a man who expected trouble only when people were awake. At the far table, Farrow unfolded his map again. He drew a tiny cross somewhere near the Loch Road, glancing around as if checking who might be watching. Hamish approached slowly. "You're finding everything you need?" Farrow didn't look up. "I prefer to rely on my own research." "That's nice," Hamish said. "Folk here dinna like being pestered." "Perhaps they don't like being reminded," Farrow said quietly. "Places like this forget things. Conveniently." Hamish felt the old prick of annoyance again. He had no wish to defend Loch Dhu to a man who had been there less than 2 hours, but he also didn't like the tone. "Enjoy your stay," he said stiffly, and turned before Farrow could say something better aimed. Outside, darkness had settled early. The rain was only a mist now, fine and cold. Hamish walked back toward the station, hands deep in his pockets. A bus might bring trouble. A stranger might bring more. He did not want either. But the village had noticed Farrow, and the village never forgot anything that threatened the quiet order of its own business. At the station door, Luggs shook himself and looked up, waiting. Hamish scratched behind his ear. "Well," he muttered, "that's the day ruined." He lit the fire, though it smoked for several minutes. Sitting beside it, he tried not to think about the cross on the map or the way Patel had gone stiff when Farrow asked about the croft. He wanted to believe the man was only making conversation. Outsiders often dug for drama where there was none. Yet the afternoon felt wrong. Luggs lay down with his chin on his paws, ears twitching at every sound from the road. Hamish stared into the small fire. If the Englishman stayed only a night or two, it might come to nothing. But Loch Dhu, he knew, was never kind to people who arrived already asking questions. He leaned back, hearing the wind pick up outside. Trouble was sniffing around the edges of the village. He could feel it as clearly as the cold seeping in under the door. And Farrow, with his map and his sharp tongue, was not done yet. The trouble had already started by the time Hamish pushed open the hotel door. Rain struck the windows hard enough to rattle the loose frame, and the bar smelled of wet wool and old soap. He had come in for a free coffee and a quiet minute, but the room had that tight feeling it got when gossip had found a fresh bone. Farrow sat at a table near the fire, dry as if the weather obeyed him, with a few villagers and 2 dripping tourists hanging on his every word. He didn't look like a man passing through. He looked like a man settling in. "I collect stories of places that forget what they've done," Farrow said. He tapped his glass with one finger as if making a point in court. "There was a man killed on the road above the loch years back, wasn't there? Hit and run. Very curious that no one was charged. You'd think a village remembers its dead." Mr. Sinclair, drying a row of glasses with unnecessary force, went red. "Folk here don't need outsiders digging up old tales," he snapped. "If something was missed, it was missed for a reason." A crofter by the door muttered that the English never knew when to stop poking. Donald McIver's widow's new husband, Alistair Ross, stood near the bar, stiff as a fence post. "You're only passing through," he said. "Leave folk be." Farrow smiled at him, thin and pleased. "Some people never really pass through, they stay in police files." Hamish felt the eyes in the room shift to him. He had seen enough puffed-up visitors stir trouble because they were bored with scenery. He stepped forward, wishing he had stayed at the station. "You're upsetting people," he said. "If you want stories, read a book, or keep to the weather." Farrow turned sharply, as if delighted by a challenge. "Perhaps the local police prefer not to remember, Constable." The room went cold. Even the tourists sensed something had been crossed. Hamish forced out a small laugh, though it tasted sour. "He's sniffing for some tabloid scandal," he told the room. "Ignore him." It was easier to say that, and easier still to believe it for the moment. Farrow's smile didn't fade. He raised his glass in a silent toast to no one in particular. People began muttering again, but now they watched Hamish too, measuring whether he truly knew what he was talking about. Hamish finished his free coffee quickly and left before Sinclair could ask anything awkward. Outside, rain slapped the pavement like a bad-tempered landlord. Luggs waited under the awning, ears back. The dog must have heard the raised voices. Back in Patel's shop later, Hamish told the same story, a little louder this time, to prove the earlier comment had been deliberate. "Just a reporter type," he said, "looking for a scandal that isn't here." Patel did not look convinced. He wrapped a loaf without meeting Hamish's eyes. "You'd better hope so," he said. "Folk remember things too well in this place." Hamish shrugged. It should have been enough to close the subject. But Rani hovered near the postbox with a worried look. She opened her mouth, then shut it again when Patel glanced at her. That night, near closing time, Farrow came back to the shop. Rani later reported it in a whisper, the way girls do when they know they shouldn't speak but can't resist. Farrow had bought a book of stamps. Then he had taken out a thick brown envelope and written something on it with deliberate care. "He posted it right there," she said. "I saw the corner of it. It said Smith & Doyle, Solicitors, Glasgow. And underneath—" She stopped as Patel gave her a sharp look. "Nothing," she finished. "Could have been anything." Hamish already felt trapped in a small, pointless lie. "He's just playing at being important," he said. "Tourists like to pretend they've uncovered a mystery." Rani frowned. It didn't look like pretending. Hamish ignored that. He shouldn't have, but he did. The wind was up when he returned to the station. Lugs paced by the door, nails clicking on the floorboards. The dog was restless, staring out toward the road as if he expected someone to appear. "Settle," Hamish said. Lugs didn't. Hamish tried the radio. Static. He tried ignoring the unsettled feeling in his stomach. Static there as well. He told himself Farrow wouldn't be in Loch Dhu long enough to matter. He told himself the villagers were only jumpy because dull weather made people brood on old things. But the envelope bothered him. Thick, private, addressed to Glasgow. And the mention of 1983 in the corner. Too specific for a gossiping tourist. Too neat. Hamish fed another bit of peat into the fire. It hissed and smoked instead of catching. He sat down anyway. Outside, the wind shoved at the door like someone testing how firmly it was latched. Lugs let out a low whine and lay down, head on paws, eyes fixed on the dark window. Hamish rubbed his face. He didn't want another outsider stirring old muck. Loch Dhu disliked being reminded of its failures, and Hamish disliked dealing with villagers who had decided the police were either fools or enemies. He told himself again that Farrow was just a bored little man with too many questions. It sounded weaker the second time. Maybe even Lugs knew it. The fire finally caught. A small flame, nothing more, but enough to show the shape of trouble gathering. It was never the obvious things that ruined a peaceful week. It was men like Farrow who arrived talking about the past as if they owned it. Hamish leaned back, uneasy. Something was moving through Loch Dhu now, and he had already made the mistake of laughing it off in front of a room full of people. He closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the dog's breathing and the lash of the wind. Farrow would not be forgotten as easily as Hamish hoped, not by the villagers, and not, he suspected, by whoever didn't want the past dragged up again. The morning felt wrong before Hamish even reached the door. The light was thin, and had that dull, raw look that meant the day had made up its mind to be miserable. Lugs paced in short, sharp lines, nails clicking, as if something outside had offended him already. Hamish had barely poured tea when the knock came. Quick, panicked, stupid knocking that only children managed. 2 schoolboys stood there, faces white and blotchy, fishing rods clutched like they were evidence of a crime. The smaller one looked ready to burst into tears. "Constable," the older boy said, voice cracking. "There's a man in the loch." Hamish didn't ask which man. Boys always expected adults to know everything anyway. He grabbed his coat, whistled Lugs, and strode out. They ran ahead, tripping over their own feet in their hurry to be helpful and important. By the time they reached the water's edge, the boys had turned silent. That was clue enough that the matter was real. The loch lay still as old metal, barely a ripple. Near the rocks, something dark bobbed. Hamish stepped down, boots sliding on the slick stones. Even before he hauled the body closer, he recognized Farrow's sharp features, now slack and swollen. The man's coat hung heavy with water. The belt twisted round him like someone had grabbed it. One arm was stuck in weed. The attaché case was nowhere in sight. Lugs whined behind him, pawing at the stones. Hamish ignored him long enough to pull Farrow partly out of the water. The face was grey. The eyes looked surprised, which was reasonable. Hamish let out a breath he didn't realise he'd been holding. "You stupid man," he muttered. Farrow had come to Loch Dhu asking for trouble, and it seemed he had found it. The boys had backed up the slope, their rods forgotten. "Is he?" the smaller one whispered. "Aye," Hamish said. "Run home. Tell your mothers you found nothing but a dead fish." They bolted. Better they spread a childish lie than the truth, which would grow sharper and nastier once adults got hold of it. He radioed Strathbane, knowing full well what would follow. Blair arrived sooner than even the worst pessimist would have guessed, leaning out of the squad car with the face of a man receiving a Christmas present early. "Well, well," Blair said loudly, stepping onto the bank with an expression of mock sympathy. "English drunk falls in the loch. You couldn't keep him off the whiskey, Macbeth?" Hamish kept his face blank. "He was sober when I saw him last night." "Sober?" Blair barked a laugh. "You're too soft to tell sober from stewed. Tourists drink, wander off, fall in. Happens all the time, and you'll write it up that way, won't you?" Hamish didn't answer. Blair didn't need answers. He needed victims. The forensic van hadn't arrived, but Blair was already impatient. "He looks drowned," Blair added, "and I dinna have time for you spinning fantasies. Write misadventure, keep Strathbane out of the headlines, and let the man rot in peace." Lugg sniffed at the shoreline again, then tugged sharply uphill, nails scraping at a patch of crushed heather several metres above the water. Hamish followed the dog's movement with his eyes. The heather was broken, a messy tear as if someone had pushed through in a hurry. "Macbeth," Blair snapped, "get away from that mutt. If you want to play detective, buy yourself a pipe. You're here to keep this tidy." Hamish looked again at the heather, then at Farrow's shoes. Clean mud, not loch mud, no greenish slime. He crouched, pretending to check the man's pockets, though he already knew the attaché case was missing. Blair loomed over him. "You're not thinking, are you? A man falls in, he falls in. If you try turning this into murder, I'll have Daviot on your back before noon." Hamish grunted, which Blair took as agreement. It wasn't, but arguing would only make Blair dig his heels in deeper. As they waited for the stretcher team, Mrs. McLean, a farmer's wife with the talent for appearing where she wasn't wanted, edged close. "Constable," she said in a low voice, "I heard shouting late last night. A man said, 'You had your chance,' then a splash." "Who was shouting?" Hamish asked. She shook her head. "Couldn't he say, but I heard it." Before Hamish could press her, Blair lumbered over. "You bothering the officer, Mrs. McLean?" She flushed. "Och, I was only saying I probably dreamt it." Blair nodded, satisfied, and moved on. Hamish watched her face. She wasn't sure if she'd lied or told the truth, or maybe she enjoyed being needed. Hard to tell with people in Lochdu. They all wanted attention until they had it. He let it go. A mistake, but it felt easier than listening to Blair preen. By afternoon, gossip had saturated the village. Hamish stopped in Patel's shop and walked straight into a wall of talk. Someone declared Farrow had cheated at cards in the hotel bar. Someone else said he'd argued with Sinclair about the bill. A fisherman insisted the Englishman had a funny look in his eye, the kind a man gets before doing something dramatic and stupid. Patel folded his arms. "Tourists die and newspapers circle," he said. "Folk won't come if they think Lochdu kills them." Hamish tried to sound sure. "Blair's calling it misadventure. That's the end of it." Patel gave him a pitying look. Nothing is the end of it when Glasgow papers want stories. The shop bell jangled with pointless energy. A crofter leaned in, eyes sharp with eagerness. "Is it true he was drunk?" "Sinclair said he was. Couldn't hold his whiskey." "He was sober when I saw him," Hamish repeated. The crofter laughed as if Hamish had told a joke too dry to understand. "Aye, well, you'd know, I suppose." Hamish ignored him. Better than snapping. News had travelled fast, too fast for comfort. Back at the station, the landline rang in the tone Hamish hated. Clipped, formal, unimpressed. Daviot. "Macbeth," he said, voice tight. "I understand there is a tourist death. A visitor from England. Do keep it quiet. No unnecessary speculation, no hint of wrongdoing. The papers must not run with a Highland scandal." Hamish stared at the wall, at the damp patch shaped like a crooked map of Scotland. "Yes, sir." "Good. Blair assures me it's straightforward. He is handling it." Of course he was. Blair handled everything the way a cow handled a vegetable garden. After the call, Hamish sat on the edge of his desk. Luggs rested his head on Hamish's knee, sensing the mood. The station felt too small, too warm, and too quiet. A dead man floated in his thoughts like a piece of driftwood he couldn't push away. He remembered the clean mud on Farrow's shoes, the broken heather higher up the slope, the missing attaché case. The shouting Mrs. McLean had been so ready to recount until Blair appeared. None of it felt tidy. But tidy was what Strathbane wanted. Tidy, simple, and quiet. In the evening, Hamish walked down to the hotel to return a key Sinclair had left at the station last week. He had no need to return it that night, but sitting still only let the wrong thoughts grow. The bar was full again. Sinclair stood stiff behind the counter. When Hamish entered, conversation thinned. A tourist whispered to his friend, "That's the constable." Another said, "Saw him with the body." Sinclair cleared his throat. "Constable, drink?" "No," Hamish said, "just the key." Sinclair took it without thanks. "Shame about the Englishman," he said, too loud. "Folk should watch themselves near water." A fisherman at the table snorted. "He argued with you last night, Sinclair." Sinclair stiffened. "Folk argue all the time. Don't mean they drown themselves." Hamish watched the exchange. Gossip turning on itself, shifting blame the way hens pecked the weakest bird. He left before someone cornered him with another theory. Outside, the air tasted of cold water and peat smoke. Lugs, waiting by the door, looked up at him, ears dipping. Hamish said nothing. The dog padded alongside him toward the station. When they reached the door, Lugs froze, staring back toward the lock as though he expected something to emerge from the darkness. "What now?" Hamish muttered. He didn't look. He wasn't sure he wanted to. Inside, he fed the fire again. It spat weakly, reluctant to burn. Much like Strathbane, it only cooperated when forced. He sat heavily on the bench, rubbing his face. Blair's voice echoed in his head. "Misadventure. Keep it tidy. Write it up." Hamish stared into the half-hearted flame. It fluttered in the damp air like it was thinking of going out. "Something's wrong," he said to the empty room. Lugs thumped his tail once in agreement, then lowered his head. Hamish let the quiet settle, but it wasn't peace. It was the kind of quiet that made a man wonder what else lay beneath it. Something had shoved Farrow into that water, or frightened him, or argued with him before he slipped. Maybe it was all innocent. Maybe Blair was right. Maybe Farrow had been drunk, angry, careless. But the heather had been crushed too far up the slope, and shoes didn't clean themselves crawling from a loch. Hamish shut his eyes. Tomorrow would bring questions he didn't want to answer, and pressure he didn't want to manage. The fire cracked, sending up a thin spark. Lugs sighed. Hamish leaned back, uneasy. Nothing about this felt finished. The Kirk Hall felt damp before anyone arrived, the kind of damp that clung to coats and made tempers shorter. Hamish stood near the doorway, watching the rain streak down the narrow windows. It wasn't proper rain, just a steady, miserable fall that made everything look worse than it was. People came in with the stiff silence that meant they'd already decided how the morning should go. Blair marched to the front as if the hall belonged to him. He threw a folder on the table and looked around with the bored triumph of a man sure he'd won before the match began. "Right," he said. "This business with the English fellow. Farrow. Simple case. Drank too much. Left the hotel in a temper. Slipped on the rocks. End of it." Mr. Sinclair, summoned to give evidence, shifted on his feet so hard the boards creaked. Someone behind Hamish muttered that the hotel was never this busy unless someone died. Sinclair tugged at his collar and said, "Aye, I might have served him whiskey." "Might have," Blair snapped. "Either you did or you didn't." "I did," Sinclair admitted, face shiny with sweat, but he was steady enough when he left. A murmur went through the hall. The villagers liked a whiskey story, but not when it involved police pressure and outsiders dying. Hamish kept silent. He kept thinking of the clean mud on Farrow's shoes and the broken heather far above the waterline. He should say something. But Daviot's note passed along through Blair had been clear. No unnecessary speculation. Blair had read the message aloud with smug relish, as if it were addressed to Hamish alone. Now the local doctor stood and declared the cause of death consistent with drowning. Blair folded his arms, triumphant. The presiding official looked at Hamish. "Constable Macbeth, you saw the body first. Anything to add?" Hamish felt every eye turn toward him. A few villagers expected him to say something sensible for once, but Blair's glare was steady, warning, daring him to cause trouble. Hamish cleared his throat. "There's nothing to show anyone else was there." The words felt like gravel in his mouth. He hated himself the moment they were out, but the hall relaxed as if a burden had lifted. "That settles it," Blair said smoothly. "Verdict, misadventure." The meeting dissolved into chatter, quick and relieved, though the relief felt sharp-edged. As they filed out, Mrs. McLean cornered Hamish by the door. Her hat tilting dangerously, she hissed, "No one asked me about the voices. I told you I heard shouting." "You said you were dreaming," Hamish muttered, wishing she'd picked someone else to torment. I only said that because Blair was glowering at me. Her lips pinched tight. You didn't back me. Hamish felt the sting of that and didn't enjoy it. I can't chase every noise folk imagine, he said, sharper than he intended. She drew herself up. Imagine, is it? Before he could soften it, she had stalked off, muttering loudly enough for others to enjoy. Outside, the rain softened, but the mood didn't. Patel's shop was full of its usual mid-morning crowd, all trying to act as though they weren't hungry for fresh scandal. Hamish pushed through the door. Another mistake. They all fell silent at once. Patel raised an eyebrow. Constable, I see the inquest was quick. It was straightforward, Hamish said. Sad, but straightforward. English deaths are bad for business, Patel said. His voice carried. Folk don't want to stay where visitors fall into water. A woman by the tinned soup shelves nodded vigorously. He should have watched himself. Rani, Patel's niece, looked worriedly at Hamish. He posted a big envelope the night before, she said. It was addressed to a solicitor in Glasgow. Maybe he was suing someone here. Rani, Patel snapped. Stop that nonsense. He glanced at a customer, then back at Hamish. Girls talk too much. Hamish watched the girl's face fall. She wasn't lying, not the way she said it. But he let the moment slip by, telling himself it was nothing. The hall had been full of nonsense already. As he left the shop, a crofter at the doorway muttered to another. Hamish called him just a tourist. That's what the constable thought of him. Hamish kept walking. There was no use correcting stupid gossip. It only grew louder. He felt Lugs brush against his leg, the dog's ears tilted back. Lugs didn't trust this mood any more than he did. They took the road toward the loch. Hamish told himself he wasn't looking for anything, just clearing his head. Lugs stopped suddenly and dug at the verge above the road, higher than where the body had been. Hamish knelt, brushing aside wet grass. A bus ticket lay there, damp but still readable. Farrow's name, the date. Hamish slipped it into his pocket. Proves nothing, he said aloud, though Lugs merely stared up at him, unconvinced. Only proves he walked here, that's all. He didn't show it to Blair. Blair would only twist it, and Hamish was tired of being twisted. By evening, the village mood had shifted again. Hotel staff whispered that Farrow had been writing notes about Lochdu before he died, as if mapping out complaints. One said he'd overheard Farrow arguing with Sinclair but didn't want to be dragged into it. Another insisted Farrow had been seen staggering, though earlier the same man had sworn he walked straight and sober. Folk in Lochdu changed their stories faster than gulls change direction. Hamish walked back to the station, Lugs padding close. He had calmed Strathbane for the moment, but his own unease felt worse than Blair's temper. Every small choice he'd made that day lay heavy on him. Inside, he lit the fire, though it smoked and smelled of damp peat. He sat down on the bench, looking at nothing. Lugs rested his chin on Hamish's boot, warm and steady. Hamish rubbed the bus ticket in his pocket. Clean mud, broken heather, a missing case, a silenced witness, and now the whole village acting as though Farrow had fallen over his own feet. He told himself to leave it, to let Blair have his tidy story. But the room felt wrong. The quiet felt wrong, and the way Lugs kept glancing toward the window made Hamish feel as though the loch itself was watching him. Tomorrow would bring more trouble. Lochdu hated unfinished business. Hamish leaned back, uneasy again, and listened to the soft hiss of the peat. Something was not settled. Not at all. Hamish knew the day was off the moment he opened the station door. Lugs stared at him in a way that suggested someone unpleasant was coming. The dog was usually right about such things. Before Hamish could pour tea, there came a firm, tidy knock. No hesitation, no village shuffle, just brisk trouble. He opened the door to find an Englishwoman in a sensible brown coat, hair pinned flat against her head, mouth tight enough to cut bread. She looked Hamish up and down as if already disappointed. "I am Margaret Farrow," she said, "from Inverness. Colin Farrow was my brother." Hamish felt the small clench in his stomach he'd been expecting ever since the inquest. He stepped back to let her in. Lugs sniffed her hem and retreated to his corner. She didn't offer him a pat, which made Hamish like her slightly more. She reached into her handbag with stiff fingers and produced a folded letter. "This came to me 2 days before he died. Read it." Hamish took it. He already hated the weight of it. Margaret watched him as though she intended to read his expression instead of the page. The letter was written in a neat, humourless hand. Colin Farrow wrote that he was returning to a Highland village that pretended a hit-and-run never happened. He wrote that if anything happens to me in Lochdu, it will not be an accident. He wrote about a car that never should have passed the kirk that night. Hamish folded it slowly, buying time, though it didn't help. Margaret's eyes narrowed. So, did he speak to you? Did you listen to him? Hamish cleared his throat. He liked to exaggerate. Some folk do. Makes their lives seem important, she snapped. He wasn't like that. He didn't invent danger to pass the time. Hamish wished she wouldn't stare at him like that. We didn't know about this letter. You do now, she said. There's a service for him today? I will attend it. Hamish nodded. It's in the Kirk Hall. Bit early, but folk want these things done quickly. Yes, she said, tone sharp as sleet. I noticed. When she left the station, walking fast enough to outrun her own anger, Luggs let out a low sigh. Hamish felt much the same. The Kirk Hall was half full. Damp coats dripped onto the floor and the electric heaters rattled without warming anything. The atmosphere was wrong, too polite, too quiet. Villagers preferred funerals when they knew what opinion to hold. Here, all they knew was that the dead man had been English and inconvenient. Margaret Farrow sat in the front row, upright and severe. A thin man from Strathbane, the kind who always smelled of newsprint, stood at the back with a notebook, head down, pretending to be discreet. Hamish noticed Blair slouch beside him, arms folded, expression gleefully sour. Blair enjoyed a mess most when he could blame Hamish for it. The minister said a few mild words about tragic timing and the mystery of life. No one looked moved. Margaret rose before he finished. My brother, she said in a strong, carrying voice, told me he feared for his life here. The hall tightened at once. Several women gasped. Patel looked down at the floor. The reporter raised his head like a dog smelling meat. Margaret continued, voice steady. He wrote that folk in this village knew more than they were saying. He did not trust the silence here. Hamish wanted to crawl under a bench. He could feel Blair's stare on the back of his neck like a cold hand. The minister, flustered, murmured something about grief. Margaret sat again with her chin raised. Afterward, before Hamish could escape, Blair cornered him beside a stack of hymn books. Macbeth, Blair said, voice low and vicious. Why wasn't that letter in the file? We only just saw it, Hamish said. It came out weak, and Blair's smile widened. You hid evidence, Blair said. Daviot will love this. He'll put you on traffic duty in Thurso if you're lucky. Hamish tried to push past him, but Blair stepped aside only when he'd finished glaring. Outside, the reporter caught up with Margaret. Hamish didn't hear their words, but he saw the reporter's eager, hungry nods. That was enough. By the time Hamish walked back to the station, the phone was already ringing. He knew the tone. Only bureaucrats rang with such confidence. Macbeth. Daviot's voice could have frozen the loch. I have just read a piece drafted for tomorrow's paper. Englishmen who warned of danger in quiet Highland village. Care to explain why I'm reading this instead of a complete, reassuring police file? We didn't have the letter, Hamish said. Not until today. And why not? Hamish rubbed his forehead. It was posted to his sister. Macbeth, Daviot said. You assured us there was nothing in this. You assured Blair. You assured me. His breath crackled down the line. If this grows legs, I will not defend you. The line went dead. Hamish sat down heavily. Luggs padded over and rested his head on Hamish's knee. The gesture didn't help. He took the letter out again. The line about the car bothered him. A car that never should have passed the kirk that night. It tied Farrow's death to the old hit-and-run, but only in a foggy, taunting way. It was a clue and a lie tangled together, the sort Hamish hated most because they looked too similar. A knock rattled the station door. Mrs. McLean stood outside, red-faced with indignation. I heard you were at the service, she said. Folk say the sister blamed us all. She was upset, Hamish said. Well, I still say I heard shouting the night he died. You changed your story, Hamish replied. Folk change their stories too often for me to chase everyone. She flushed. If someone pushed that man, you'll have yourself to blame. She marched away before he could answer. Hamish watched her go, feeling the day sag deeper. He had misjudged her once already, and now he'd done it again. Inside, he set the kettle on. Luggs settled in the corner, curling his paws under him. The village felt watched now, watched by Strathbane, by the press, by Margaret Farrow's sharp eyes, and watched by its own guilt, which tended to come out nastier than anything else. Hamish stared at the letter one last time. The words sat on the page like a curse someone had been saving. He folded it carefully, though it didn't deserve the care, and put it in the desk drawer. Nothing felt steady. Not the evidence, not the villagers, not even his own choices. Something had shifted in Loch Dhu, and it wouldn't shift back. Hamish knew something unpleasant was waiting for him when Luggs began pacing before the station door had even opened. The dog only did that for Storms, Drunks, or Priscilla Halberton Smythe. When the sleek silver car rolled into Loch Dhu and stopped with the neat finality of wealth, Hamish felt his stomach dip. Priscilla stepped out, elegant and annoyed, as though Loch Dhu had offended her by existing. She walked toward him with her usual calm disdain. "Father says bookings have already been cancelled," she said, not bothering with a greeting. "You told everyone it was an accident." Hamish opened his mouth, then shut it again. Anything he said would sound like an excuse. "Come with me," she added. "We'll talk at the hotel." He followed her in silence, Luggs trotting behind, ears back in wary confusion. Riding beside Priscilla always made Hamish feel like a stray mutt someone had allowed into a limousine by mistake. She drove as though the car would scold her if she let the wheels slip half an inch. At the Tommel Castle Hotel, the staff straightened as she entered, though their eyes flicked nervously toward Hamish. The place carried the faint smell of fear of cancellations, complaints, and bad headlines. Priscilla led him to the lounge and sat with the impatient grace of someone accustomed to better company. She reached into her bag and set a thin file on the table. "A friend in insurance owed me a favour," she said. "Colin Farrow wasn't just a tiresome man with a notebook. He was once an investigator." Hamish's shoulders tensed. "For what?" "For matters like this," she said. "Road fatalities, claims, fraud, cover-ups." She tapped the folder. "He worked on a case years ago, near a loch in the Highlands. He thought it was crooked. He kept talking about it in the office." Hamish took the file. The photocopies were grainy but clear enough. An old report naming no village, a sketch of a bend in the road, scribbled notes muttering about a local car with a dented wing, mentions of no charges filed. One note had a single word underlined: Loch Dhu. Hamish felt heat rise in his neck. He had told villagers more than once that Farrow was only a gossiping nuisance. Now he held the proof that Farrow had come here with purpose. Priscilla watched him calmly. "If there was a cover-up in this village, you cannot leave it alone, unless you're still hoping no one notices." He stared at the pages, as if they would rearrange themselves into something harmless. "Strathbane is already looking into it," he lied. Priscilla's expression didn't change, but he felt her disapproval as clearly as if she'd slapped him. "Blair," she said, "is not a complete fool." Hamish knew that was a lie on her part, but he didn't correct her. He only murmured, "He's busy." "Doing nothing," she replied. "Which suits you, I suppose." He closed the folder and stood. "I'll take it from here." "You'd better," she said. "Loch Dhu's reputation is not yours alone to ruin." Her words struck deeper than he liked. She had always been able to do that, without raising her voice. Later in the bar, her presence worked like a stone dropped in a shallow pond. Conversations broke and reformed in uneasy ripples. Villagers glanced at her, then at Hamish, then back again. A tourist whispered, "Who's she?" "Big house," someone muttered. "Her lot don't mix with the likes of us." "She thinks she owns the police," another said. Hamish pretended he didn't hear. He pretended he didn't notice that the bar staff straightened whenever Priscilla looked their way, or that people who had ignored Farrow before now discussed him as though they'd been his closest friends. Mr. Sinclair came over, his face heavy with annoyance. "If that Englishman had kept his mouth shut," he said, "he'd be alive and we'd have our bookings." Priscilla looked at him the way a duchess might study a beetle. "Perhaps," she said, "if your establishment had managed normal hospitality, he would be." Sinclair flushed. "I've run this place for 20 years, and now people are cancelling," she said. "I'm sure you'll find someone to blame." Hamish stepped between them, though he wasn't sure on whose behalf. "Let's not start more trouble." Priscilla raised an eyebrow. "It has already begun." Hamish wished she would leave the bar. Loch Dhu didn't like outsiders showing off their poise. Villagers admired her, resented her, and feared her opinions all at once, which meant every word she spoke would turn into gossip before the hour was out. She left soon after, giving Hamish a polite nod that felt more like a judgment. When the door closed behind her, half the bar exhaled as if a storm had passed. Hamish finished his warm beer and called Lugs to his side. The dog had lain under the table the whole time, head flat on his paws, his way of saying he despised hotel bars and the people in them. Outside, drizzle coated everything in a thin sheen. The road glistened like old tarmac used to when it couldn't be bothered to dry. The smell of peat smoke drifted from a few chimneys. Ordinary enough, but Hamish felt no comfort in it. Priscilla's file weighed on him. So did her cold certainty that he had failed before he'd even begun. She was right about one thing. Farrow hadn't been here for a holiday. And Hamish, in trying to keep peace in a village that never stayed peaceful, had told too many people too many easy things. Walking away from the hotel, he felt Lugs press close to his leg, uneasy. "Aye, I ken," Hamish murmured. "It's all turning foul." The drizzle thickened, but he didn't hurry. There was no point. Trouble was already following him, steady as a shadow. Farrow's notes, the old case, the dented car, Priscilla's cold eyes, all of it was waiting for him to trip. By the time he reached the station, he knew he had no choice left but to investigate properly, whether he wanted to or not. He unlocked the door, Lugs slipping in first. The dog sniffed, then looked back at Hamish with that expression that always meant, "You've made things worse again." Hamish sighed. "Aye," he said quietly, "I have." He shut the door against the drizzle, though it did nothing to shut out the trouble. Hamish arrived at Patel's shop already knowing the morning would go badly. Lugs balked at the doorway, tail low, as if he sensed that stepping inside meant walking straight into someone else's anger. The smell of spices and damp newspapers mixed in the cramped air, and 3 customers stood about pretending to browse when everyone knew they were only delaying their exit to hear whatever trouble was brewing. Patel was behind the counter arranging a stack of tins. He didn't look up. That was wrong in itself. Patel always looked up. Hamish cleared his throat. "I need a word," he said. Patel finally glanced over, the look clipped and wary. "We sell stamps, Constable. We don't read people's letters." Hamish hadn't even asked the question yet. "Someone said Farrow posted something the night before he died. I'm only checking who might have seen him." "We mind our own business," Patel said, straightening tins that didn't need straightening. "You should try it." Before Hamish could reply, Rani popped her head around the shelves. "He sent it to a solicitor in Glasgow," she said brightly. "I saw Lochdu 1983 on the corner." Patel barked something sharp in Gujarati, and the girl flinched. "She imagines things," he said quickly, "always making stories." One of the customers by the bread rack froze in place, the way villagers did when they heard something juicy. Hamish could almost feel the gossip sprouting like fungus in the damp. "I'd just like the truth of it," Hamish said. "Did he post anything here?" Patel's jaw tightened. "Folk come and go. Postboxes get used. Nothing strange about that." "That envelope's important," Hamish said. He kept his voice steady. "If he wrote something about the village, then why wasn't it found with him?" Patel snapped. "Why are you asking me? Because we're not born here. Because it's easier to trouble my shop than trouble your own people." The customers exchanged delighted looks. Nothing pleased Lochdu more than seeing Hamish accused of unfairness. Before Hamish could answer, the bell tinkled, and the bread rack eavesdropper slipped out. That wasn't good. Whatever he'd heard would be repeated by lunchtime, and by tea-time it would have grown horns. Rani edged closer. "Uncle, he did ask for old newspapers, remember? You fetched them from the back, from the year of that accident on the Loch Road." Patel glared at her so fiercely she shrank behind a display of biscuits. Hamish seized on it anyway. "So, he read them? Here?" Patel looked away. "He asked for history. I gave him what I had, that's all." The bell chimed again as 2 more customers entered, eyes bright with curiosity. Hamish suddenly felt trapped in a goldfish bowl. "Thank you," he muttered, though it wasn't enough. It was never enough. He stepped outside into the cold air, but Patel followed him out. The man's usual patience was gone, replaced by something tight and brittle. "You brought this into my shop," Patel hissed, low enough that passers-by would only hear the tone, not the words. "You protect them, not us. Now people think we're helping outsiders send things against Lochdu." Hamish blinked. "Against the village? That's nonsense." "Aye," Patel said bitterly, "and nonsense spreads faster than truth." 2 crofters strolled past at that exact moment, giving Patel a wide, polite berth, the kind that meant they'd been talking about him already. One murmured to the other, loud enough for Hamish to hear, "Selling folk to lawyers now, is he?" Patel winced. Luggs growled under his breath. "It'll blow over," Hamish said, though even he didn't believe it. "You always say that," Patel replied, "and yet we're the ones paying the price." He went back inside without waiting for an answer. Hamish stood there, feeling more useless than usual. The wind lifted the edges of his coat. Luggs pressed against his shin, uneasy. By midday, the village had done its worst. A fisher at the harbour said he was getting his groceries from Strathbane, until things settle. A woman at the Kirk Hall refused a parcel because she didn't want her name mixed up in anything. At the post office, 2 pensioners discussed the Patels' secret dealings as if they'd witnessed them firsthand. Hamish tried to correct one rumour, but the listeners nodded politely with the glazed look of people who had already decided the truth tasted better with seasoning. Back at the shop later, Patel barely acknowledged him. Rani hovered near the counter, looking miserable. Hamish leaned in. "Look, about Farrow," Patel cut him off. "He sat right there," he said, pointing to a stool near the window. "Read those old newspapers like he was searching for something. Asked if people remembered clearly, like we are all liars. That's the truth of it. And now my customers act as though I hid something from them." "He read the papers from the year of the accident?" Hamish asked. Patel nodded reluctantly. "From 83. I only kept them because folk wrapped fish in them before the regulations came in. He said he needed to understand what the village had forgotten. Those were his words." Hamish felt a cold knot form in his stomach. This was more than idle curiosity. Farrow had come hunting for a story already decades old, and now the village was turning on itself because of it. "Thank you," Hamish said. Patel's laugh was short and tired. "Don't thank me. Fix it." Hamish left the shop with Luggs at his heel. The dog looked up, worried. Even he sensed the shift in the village. Not loud, not dramatic, just the quiet unravelling of trust, thread by thread. By evening, Hamish had become the safe target for everyone's frustration. A tourist overheard that he'd dismissed Farrow as just a tourist before the death and repeated it at the hotel bar. Sinclair told anyone who would listen that Hamish had stirred up trouble for hard-working shopkeepers. Mrs. McLean said she wouldn't be surprised if Hamish had scared Farrow off with one of his moods. The whole village twisted in on itself like wet rope. Hamish walked home through drifting peat smoke, head low. Luggs trotted close, brushing against him with each step. He had one useful clue, the newspapers from 1983. It tied Farrow straight back to the old hit and run. But every inch he pulled on that thread, the village pulled away from him. He unlocked the station door. The room welcomed him with the same stale warmth and smell of damp peat it always had. But it felt smaller tonight. He felt smaller too. Luggs settled uneasily near the hearth. Hamish sat down, elbows on his knees. The gossip, the anger, Patel's strained voice, they all pressed in. If he didn't solve this quickly, Lochdu would eat itself alive. He stared at the cold hearth, wishing the fire would light itself. Nothing felt steady anymore, and he had only just begun to tug at the truth. The day had already turned sour before Hamish left the station. The drizzle was that thin, mean sort that didn't fall so much as hang in the air, settling on everything like a judgment. Luggs refused to step out at first, bristling at some mood he felt on the wind, but Hamish coaxed him along the loch road. He had no patience left for weather or hesitation. Someone in Lochdu knew more than they were saying, and he was tired of pretending otherwise. The croft above the road looked worse than he remembered. Ragged fields, a tractor half mended and half abandoned, fencing leaning as though the land itself wanted to escape. Hamish thought it a depressing place for anyone to come back to, let alone a widow. Mrs. Ross, Mrs. McIver once, opened the door before he could knock. Her mouth tightened at the sight of him. "You had 20 years to ask," she said without greeting. "Now because some Englishman falls in the loch, you care?" Hamish shifted on his feet. "I'm only trying to clear things up." "You clear nothing," she replied, stepping aside in a stiff, reluctant gesture. "You stir. That's all the police ever do up here." He followed her inside. The kitchen smelled of boiled cabbage and damp wood. She poured tea with the same resentment she offered conversation. Luggs sat under the table, paws tucked close, watching her like she might snap a broom over Hamish's head. "I'd like to ask about the night your first husband died," Hamish said quietly. Her eyes flashed. You should have asked when it mattered. I ken that, he murmured. But there's talk now. And Farrow, he spoke to you, aye? Her shoulders sagged. She looked older suddenly, worn thin by years of keeping the same answer ready for anyone who pried. He came 2 nights ago, she said, sat there, soaking wet, asking about a car with a dented wing, asking about men from the Kirk Committee helping after the accident. Hamish glanced up. Helping? He knew more than he said. Her voice went low. He knew details he had no right to know. He said the police never looked hard enough back then. Hamish flushed at that, though she hadn't meant it personally. At least he hoped she hadn't. She hesitated, but before she could say more, Alistair Ross came in, wiping grease from his hands with a rag that only spread the stains. He was a broad man with a face that always looked half accused. "What's this, then?" he demanded. "You upsetting her?" "No," Hamish said, though the man's tone made him want to lie more convincingly. "Just speaking about Farrow." "You've spoken enough," Ross snapped. "Leave her be." Mrs. Ross put down her cup with a shaky clink. "It's fine, Alistair." "It's not fine," he replied. "Every time the police come near this house, nothing good follows. Off you go, constable. You've done your damage." Hamish stood awkwardly. It would only make things worse to argue. "Thank you for your time," he said, though he doubted she felt it was worth much. Outside, the drizzle hardened to something colder. Lugg strained at his lead and growled, staring up the road. Hamish followed the dog's gaze. Rory McPhee's old Land Rover rumbled past, tyres spitting mud. Rory was a Kirk elder and liked people to remember it. He slowed just enough to tip 2 fingers from the wheel. "I organised a wee collection for the widow back then," Rory called through the cracked window. "Charity, Macbeth, you should try it." "Very generous of you," Hamish said, though it came out drier than peat dust. Rory drove on, leaving the stink of old diesel and something sharper, old pride, old guilt, who knew which. Lugs continued growling until the vehicle disappeared. If Rory heard, he pretended not to. Hamish trudged back toward the Croft door, but Mrs. Ross stepped outside before he reached it. She folded her arms, making herself small against the wind. "One more thing," she said. "After he left here, Farrow didn't go back to the hotel." Hamish straightened. "Where did he go?" "He walked along the Loch Road, that direction." She pointed past the bend toward the scrub where the road climbed. "Had his attaché case with him. He looked determined, like someone going to meet someone." "You're sure he didn't head back to the village?" "I watched him," she said simply. "He was going up where the accident happened, up where that Englishman shouldn't have been nosing around." Hamish rubbed his chin. That didn't fit Blair's picture of a man stumbling drunk toward water. It fit something else entirely, someone following a trail of secrets. "Thank ye," he said. "Truly." Mrs. Ross's face tightened. "Don't thank me. Find out what chased my first husband into the ground and brought that Englishman after him." She closed the door before he could reply. Hamish stood there a moment, letting the rain prick at his neck. Lugs nudged his leg, uneasy. "Aye," Hamish muttered. "I get it. This place is a nest of old grudges." They walked back toward Loch Dhu, though he didn't hurry. His steps felt heavier with each one. He'd pushed too hard with Mrs. Ross, then backed off too quickly when Ross barked. And he'd let Rory sail past without challenging him, when the man clearly enjoyed reminding everyone of his generosity. Generous men were often the worst when trouble came. They liked to make sure the world knew what they'd paid for. The drizzle turned to mist that clung to the hedges and blurred the road ahead. Hamish tried not to think of Farrow walking this very stretch, clutching his case, heading towards someone who didn't want him coming. He had no answers, only scraps. Farrow's questions, the dented car rumour, the Kirk men who had helped, and Mrs. Ross's grim certainty that Farrow had not turned back towards safety. Lugs pressed against him again as if urging him onward, though not encouragingly, more like a dog saying, "You're in it now, and you'll not walk out clean." Hamish trudged on in silence. By the time he reached the outskirts of Loch Dhu, he felt wetter, colder, and no wiser. The village waited for him like it always did, tight-lipped, stubborn, and full of people who thought they were owed answers but refused to give any. He had the uneasy sense that Farrow had walked straight into a knot of loyalties on that dark road, and the knot was still tightening. Hamish touched Lugs's head. "Come on, wee man," he murmured. "We've stirred enough trouble for one day." They turned toward the station, the drizzle closing around them like a curtain, leaving the Croft and its ghosts behind, but not far enough behind. Blair arrived in Lochdu like a man preparing to unveil a masterpiece, though the only masterpiece Blair ever produced was a mess. Hamish knew trouble had landed the moment he saw Anderson's sycophantic grin pressed against the passenger window of the Strathbane car. Lugs began barking long before the engine stopped. Dogs always sensed Blair's moods, and Blair's current mood was the colour of spoiled milk. Blair didn't bother with the police station. He went straight into Patel's shop, shoving the door so hard the bell nearly leapt off its hook. Hamish followed on foot, already dreading the scene. Inside, half the village was pretending to buy something. Patel looked murderous. Blair cleared his throat as if about to address Parliament. "Right, listen up," he thundered. "I've got fresh intelligence." The villagers leaned in greedily. Anything Blair called intelligence was bound to be rubbish, but entertaining rubbish. Anderson stepped forward, puffing himself up. "Message from Glasgow," he said, in the tone of someone reporting a royal birth. "Constable there says a certain individual once boasted in a bar." Blair lifted a hand. "Aye, I'll tell it. This man," he paused, savouring the attention, "said he knocked someone into a ditch years ago and got away with it." Hamish closed his eyes briefly. He already knew where this was going. "Who?" asked one of the crofters, delighted. Blair jabbed a finger toward the window. "Tam McNab." A small gasp rippled across the room, followed by the kind of smug murmur villagers reserved for people they disliked. Hamish said, "Tam? He havers all sorts in a bar. Half of Lochdu has bragged about something they never did." Blair ignored him. "He killed McIver back then, and when Farrow sniffed around, he panicked and did him in too." Patel muttered, "Ridiculous," but quietly, as if afraid Blair would arrest him next. Anderson added, "Likely story, sir," nodding with such enthusiasm he nearly dropped his notebook. Within minutes, Blair had stomped up the track to Tam's shabby cottage. Neighbours gathered like gulls around a trawler. Hamish stayed far enough back to avoid encouraging Blair, but close enough to intervene if the arrest turned cruel, even by Blair's standards. Tam burst out the door, hair wild, eyes blazing. "I was in Inverness jail that week," he shouted as Blair grabbed him. "Ask them. Ask anyone. I was inside." Blair twisted his arm. "Aye, and you've been dodging justice ever since. Get in the car." Lugs barked furiously, pulling at the lead, but Hamish held him back. Some villagers muttered, "He's a bad lot. Time he paid for something." Others crossed their arms, scowling. Mrs. McLean, enjoying herself far too much, said loudly, "Well, he could have done it." "That's enough," Hamish snapped, but she only sniffed at him. Hamish watched the whole farce unfold with a hollowness in his stomach. Blair was too pleased with himself. It meant he had stopped thinking entirely. Once Tam was shoved into the back of the car, Hamish leaned in. "You checked his alibi?" he asked Anderson quietly. Anderson blinked. "His what?" "His claim about being in Inverness jail when McIver died." "Oh." Anderson looked over his shoulder nervously. "The inspector said not to waste time with old paperwork." Hamish swore under his breath. Blair would rather arrest the moon than read a file. Back at the station, Blair strutted in as though he owned the place. "Write it up, Macbeth," he barked. "Case tied in a bow." Hamish didn't answer. Blair stormed out again, eager to telephone Daviot with his triumph. Anderson followed, leaving the faint smell of fear behind him. Once they were gone, Hamish picked up the receiver and called Strathbane, asking for the old sergeant he trusted more than he trusted the so-called investigators. "Aye, I mind Tam McNab," the sergeant grumbled. "Frequent lodger in the Inverness cells. Far as I remember, he was inside round then. Wouldn't surprise me at all. Drunk and disorderly every other Friday." "That week?" Hamish pressed. "Aye, fairly sure," the sergeant said. "Check the records if Blair hasn't burned them yet." Hamish thanked him and hung up. He stared at the empty station a moment. A poacher with a rusty van, drunk half the time, bragging the other half. This was Blair's killer. 2 deaths, years apart. Rubbish. It stank worse than Tam's cottage. But Blair told Daviot it was solved, and Daviot, terrified of headlines, would take any solution that let him sleep. By evening, the village had split itself neatly in two. Those who wanted Tam punished for every rabbit he'd ever poached were delighted. Those who disliked Blair, far more numerous, said he was using Tam as a shield against the press. Hamish walked along the harbour, Lugs close at his heel. The dog kept glancing back toward the road as if expecting someone to follow. "Aye, I feel it too," Hamish muttered. "Something's wrong. All the wrong folk are too happy." He stopped by the water's edge, staring at the dark surface. If Tam wasn't the link between Farrow and McIver, someone else had been on the Loch Road that night. Someone confident Blair would never look in their direction. Luggs let out a soft whine. Hamish rubbed his neck. "Tomorrow," he said. "We start again tomorrow." He turned back toward the station, shoulders heavy, knowing Blair's false victory had made everything harder. The real killer, if there was one, would feel safer now. The village would feel more frightened, and Hamish was left the awkward man in the middle, asking questions no one wanted to hear. The drizzle began again, cold and persistent. Hamish didn't hurry. Trouble was already keeping pace with him. Hamish knew the day was already going wrong when his coat refused to dry, no matter how close he held it to the sputtering fire in the station. Luggs stared at it, as if blaming the coat for everything else that was failing. Hamish couldn't disagree. With Tam locked up on Blair's orders and half the village convinced justice had been done, he felt like the only man in Loch Dhu who knew the truth had gone crooked. So he took the early bus to Strathbane, damp coat and all. The ride was long, cold, and smelt faintly of wet wool and despair. By the time he reached headquarters, his hair had flattened to a miserable fringe, and his patience had thawed into irritation. Daviot's secretary looked him up and down as though he'd arrived carrying livestock. "He's very busy," she sniffed. "He'll be less busy when the press starts shrieking again," Hamish muttered. She let him through with a sour look. Daviot sat behind his desk, expression clenched as if the paperwork itself offended him. He tapped a pencil against a blotter in neat, nervous strokes. "What now, Macbeth?" he asked without warmth. Hamish laid out everything he had, the envelope to the solicitor, Farrow's old investigator background, the scrap of information about the fatal accident, Mrs. Ross's account of Farrow walking up the Loch Road with his case, and his own unease about Tam's arrest. Daviot listened, though not with interest. His pencil tapping grew more irritated. When Hamish finished, Daviot sighed. "I cannot authorise a full reopening of a 20-year-old case on gossip and bus tickets." "It's more than that," Hamish said. "The man died after asking questions about McIver. He—" "Enough," Daviot lifted a hand. "You want to dig into old village quarrels, do it in your own time. Officially, Blair has his man. That is where the matter stands." Hamish stared at him. The refusal was complete, icy and efficient. Daviot leaned back. "Macbeth, you are not to disturb the file further, and I will not have Blair calling me every hour claiming you are undermining his authority." Hamish swallowed his temper. Blair had no authority worth undermining, but saying so wouldn't help. I hear you," he said. "Good," Daviot replied. "Close the door behind you. You're dripping on the carpet." Hamish left Strathbane feeling like a door had been shut in his face twice, once politely, once thoroughly. Back in Loch Dhu the air felt colder, as if the village itself disapproved of his persistence. Luggs trotted beside him, ears twitching, alert to tension that Hamish couldn't yet name. He tried another angle. Rory McPhee, Kirk Elder and self-appointed guardian of propriety, was at his gate stacking firewood and admiring himself for doing so. "Rory," Hamish began, "I'm needing a look at old Kirk session minutes. Charity accounts too, from the time McIver died." Rory smiled with all the warmth of a man welcoming a tax inspector. "Those are private papers, Macbeth. We don't hand them over to every policeman who takes a notion. It's official business." "No, it's your business," Rory said, still smiling. "Blair has arrested the guilty man. You should follow his lead." Hamish felt his jaw tighten. "I'll need them eventually." "You'll need a warrant," Rory replied smoothly, "and I doubt Strathbane will give you one. Good day." Hamish walked off before he said something unwise. Luggs kept glancing back at Rory's house, tail twitching. At the Kirk Hall, Hamish hoped to find someone less obstructive. The door was open, a sign the Women's Guild had been sorting through boxes again and left the place in its usual state, half tidy, half chaos. He stepped inside. Stacks of old papers were piled on tables. Notices about bake sales and choir rehearsals fluttered in a draft. On one box, acting as a makeshift coaster beneath a mug ring, lay a torn agenda from years back. Hamish picked it up. Most of the items were irrelevant, roof repairs, flower rota, but in the margin, in a different hand, was a note. Farrow, visitor to be heard about road safety. The name was scorched into his thoughts. Farrow had been here before, not investigating the Croft death from afar, not guessing, not theorising. He had come to Loch Dhu years earlier to raise concerns, and someone had crossed the note out. Hamish folded the scrap and slipped it into his coat, ignoring the water still clinging to the seams. Outside, the mist had thickened into a fine, needling drizzle. The village looked blurred at the edges, as though everything and everyone were backing away from the truth. Doors were closing, Strathbanes, Rorys, half the villages. Blair, meanwhile, strutted about claiming his case was solved, while Hamish carried only scraps and suspicions. Luggs nudged his knee with a soft, uncertain sound. "Aye, lad," Hamish muttered. "We're shut out on all sides." He started toward the station, coat heavier now with damp and with the weight of the folded scrap in his pocket. If he wanted the truth, he would have to find it with no authority, no support, and in a village that now wished he would stop asking questions entirely. The mist swallowed him and Luggs as they walked, and Hamish felt every step pushing him deeper into a case no one wanted solved. Hamish knew he was in trouble the moment he opened the station door and found a wet, half-chewed envelope shoved under it. Someone had scrawled "Do your job" across the front. No name, no return address. Luggs stood over it with his hackles raised as if guarding the world from an especially rude mouse. "Grand," Hamish muttered. "Now they're writing to me." He tossed it onto the desk without opening it. Strathbane had shut him out. The Kirk had shut him out. Half the villagers thought he was stirring trouble. The other half thought he wasn't stirring enough. He needed someone respectable, someone whose reputation was still intact. Rory McPhee came to mind at once. Neat farm, neat accounts, neat morals. A Kirk elder with the kind of steady manners that impressed Daviot and kept gossip gentle. A man like that could help clear the fog. So Hamish walked over to Rory's farm, coat dripping and patience thin. Rory opened the door with a smile that was just a shade too warm, but Hamish was tired enough to accept it. "Come away in," Rory said. "You look drowned." Inside, the kitchen was tidy to the point of annoyance. Every tin and jar faced the same direction. The kettle boiled as though afraid to do it too loudly. Rory poured tea with an air of reluctant hospitality, the sort that said he thought the police should bring their own cups. Hamish sat, Luggs slumping by his feet. "I've been thinking about the old accident," Hamish began. Rory's expression went grave at once. "Terrible thing," he said. "Man died on the road, widow left behind. I pushed for a collection at the Kirk, you ken. Fairness for the family." Hamish nodded. He remembered the collection, though not the details. "If there's been wrong done," Rory continued, stirring his tea with careful movements, "it wasn't by decent men trying to help. Folk forget that. Folk twist stories. That English fellow, Farrow, he was always making trouble. He came to me once, nosing around about road safety." Rory shook his head. Saw malice where there was only kindness. His tone was mild, words neat and polished, like ironing creases into a lie. Hamish, worn down by everyone else's hostility, felt Rory's calmness settle on him like a blanket. "Aye," Hamish said quietly. "Farrow did like stirring." Rory sighed. "You've enough trouble on your hands. Just keep your head down. Blair's made his arrest. No need to drag good men through old mud." It was said with the kind of gentle authority villagers obeyed without thinking. Even Hamish, who should have known better, felt himself nodding. When he left the farm, he was so relieved to have one respectable man in the mess that he went straight to the station and wrote a short note to Daviot. "Rory McPhee has always behaved with integrity. Any suspicion aimed at him seems misplaced and unfair." He sealed it before he could second-guess himself. A clean, official endorsement, exactly the sort of mistake he specialised in. Outside, Luggs tugged sharply at the lead, dragging Hamish back toward the peat stack behind Rory's shed. The dog snuffled hard, whining, paws scrabbling at the base. "What now?" Hamish grumbled. Luggs pressed his nose into the peat, then looked up with a troubled whine. Hamish knelt, though the mud soaked straight through his trousers. He caught a faint whiff of petrol, unexpected in a neat, tidy farmyard. He frowned. "It's nothing," he told himself. "Probably spilled from the tractor." Luggs whined again, but Hamish pulled him away. He was cold, soaked, and tired of chasing shadows. On the walk back to Loch Dhu, he passed the Tommel Castle Hotel and stopped short when he heard Sinclair's voice carrying from the back door. The hotelier was talking to his barman in the tone of a man who'd had enough of everyone else's stupidity. "If that Englishman had kept his mouth shut," Sinclair said, "he'd be alive, and we wouldn't be dealing with this shambles." Hamish stiffened. It was an ugly thing to say, sharper than Sinclair usually dared. The barman muttered something in reply, but Hamish didn't catch it. He didn't need to. The sentence had lodged in his mind like a burr. He began watching Sinclair more closely as he walked away, ignoring Luggs's persistent backward glances toward the peat stack. Sinclair's temper has always been foul, Hamish muttered, almost comforted by the familiarity of it. Wouldn't surprise me if he snapped at Farrow. It felt easier than chasing petrol smells in a farmyard that Daviot wouldn't let him investigate anyway. Luggs whined again, low and uncertain. Hamish patted his head distractedly. "Later," he said. "We'll deal with it later." But even as he said it, he knew he was backing the wrong man and following the wrong scent, and that Loch Dhu, in its quiet, punishing way, would make him pay for it. He and Luggs walked back into the village, the drizzle turning to a fine, miserable mist. Hamish felt no wiser, only wetter and more trapped than before. And somewhere behind him, in a neat farm with tidy ledgers, a shed full of peat was keeping a smell he should not have ignored. Hamish knew something was off the moment the Strathbane car pulled up outside the station. Luggs slunk under the desk as if expecting a raid. Anderson stuck his head through the door, looking both apologetic and eager. "Inspector wants ye in Strathbane," he said. "Now." Hamish didn't bother asking why. If Blair was involved, the reason would be stupid, cruel, or both. He left Luggs with a bone he wouldn't touch and climbed into the back of the car, coat still damp from the morning. Strathbane headquarters smelled of old carpet and disinfectant, which always made Hamish think of disappointment. Anderson led him into a cramped meeting room where Blair sat with a smirk plastered across his puffy face. Beside him lounged a thin detective inspector with a look of cultivated boredom. A file lay on the table. On top of it, Margaret Farrow's letter. The inspector tapped it. "You only received this after the inquest?" Hamish stiffened. "Aye, it came late. It wasn't part of the original file." "It mentions fear for his life," the inspector interrupted. "It indicates potential foul play, yet it wasn't placed in the official file." Blair grunted with malicious satisfaction. "Our Highland Sherlock decided it wasn't important." Hamish felt heat rise up his neck. "I misjudged it," he said plainly. "It came late. No one cares when it came," Blair snapped. "You hid it." "I did not hide." But Daviot appeared at that moment in the doorway, his face pinched and pale. "Enough," he said sharply. "Macbeth, there are already letters in the paper calling this death in a secretive Highland village. One columnist hints at police incompetence. Another writes about a culture of silence. We cannot afford amateurism." Hamish felt each word land like a slap. Daviot continued, voice flat. "You supplied incomplete paperwork. You allowed gossip to overtake the narrative. You failed to report significant correspondence. This is not village loafers and sheep rustling. This is a death with national attention. Do you understand?" Hamish swallowed. "Aye." "Say it properly," Blair said, leaning forward like a child begging for a sweet he didn't deserve. Hamish forced the words. "Aye, sir, I understand." Blair leaned back, triumphant. Anderson stared at the table, ashamed, though Hamish suspected he was only ashamed to be present. The thin inspector riffled the file again, unimpressed with everyone. "You may go," Daviot said, "and for heaven's sake, Macbeth, no more surprises." Hamish left the room feeling scraped out. The walk down the corridor took longer than the entire meeting. At the reception desk, a junior clerk pretended not to have been listening but failed miserably. Her cheeks were pink with embarrassment on his behalf. She cleared her throat. "Constable Macbeth?" He paused, wary. She held out a small note. "This came in this morning about the Englishman's post. It wasn't filed yet. I thought you should... I thought you might want it." Hamish hesitated, then took it. Her eyes flickered with sympathy, something that made him feel far worse. On the bus back to Loch Dhu, he unfolded the note. "Smith & Doyle, solicitors, Glasgow envelope reported posted from Loch Dhu has not arrived. Please confirm date and office used." Hamish stared at it. So the envelope Farrow posted, the thick brown one Rani had seen, never reached its destination. Someone had taken it after it went into the postbox. That narrowed it down sharply. Anyone near the shop. Anyone with access to the night post. Hotel staff who saw Farrow writing letters. Anyone lurking about the Kirk that evening. And one more possibility he didn't want to consider but knew he must. Whoever feared what Farrow had written. When he stepped off the bus, the village had already heard everything. Word travelled fast if it showed Hamish in a bad light. In Patel's shop, conversation stopped as soon as he entered. Rani looked stricken, Patel looked furious, and two crofters pretended to compare prices on tinned peas with exaggerated interest. Hamish bought nothing and survived the silence long enough to reach the door. As he left, one villager murmured just loud enough, "Hid evidence, they say." Outside, the mist clung low, and the lock air tasted of damp stone. Lugs trotted up, sensing the bitterness sticking to Hamish like mud. Back in the station, Hamish sat down heavily and reread the note. Blair had the wrong man in custody. The village had started to view Hamish as a nuisance. Strathbane wanted the matter buried, and someone in Lochdu had stolen a dead man's final message. Lugs laid his head on Hamish's boot, tail barely moving. Hamish reached down and scratched behind the dog's ear, the closest thing to comfort he'd get tonight. "We're in it now," he muttered, "and worse alone than before." He folded the solicitor's note, set it on the desk, and stared at the dead hearth. The village was closing its doors. The police had turned their backs. Someone in Lochdu was hunting secrets, and Hamish Macbeth was the only one left digging. Hamish felt the wrongness before he understood it. Lugs had stopped dead in the middle of the track, paws braced, whining low in his throat. The raw wind off the loch rattled the thin branches overhead, but the dog's eyes were fixed on Rory McPhee's farmyard ahead, dark as a pit. "Come on, then," Hamish muttered, giving the lead a small tug. Lugs refused to move. No growl, no bark, just that stiff fear animals showed when nothing sensible explained it. Hamish frowned. The dog had never balked at Rory's place before. He tried again, and again Lugs dug in. Hamish, cold and cross, was about to haul him bodily when something else caught his eye. The ditch beside the track had flooded with the day's rain. Something pale drifted on the surface, wavering in the weak beam of his torch. Hamish stepped closer, boots sinking in the wet verge. He reached down and hooked the thing out with 2 fingers. It came up soft and limp. Paper, half burned, the edges curled and blackened. He wiped mud away with his sleeve. It was a photograph, an old car, a dented wing, a signpost behind it reading Lochdu 2 miles. On the back, in faded ink, someone had written, "McIver accident, evidence." Hamish stared at it longer than he meant to. Lugs whined again, pulling away from the yard as if it hid all the fires of hell. "Fine," Hamish said shortly. "We're not going in." He put the photograph in his pocket and walked the dog home through the wind that smelled faintly of petrol. By nightfall, he had decided he was done asking nicely. If the Kirk Hall held answers, the Kirk would not give them. So he took his torch, left Lugs curled on the station rug, and slipped out into the drizzle. The hall door lock was so old it barely resisted. One sharp push and he was inside. He shut the door behind him and stood in the stale dark. Old hymn books and musty curtains gave off a dry smell that clung to everything. He found the boxes stacked near the vestry, old minutes, leaflets, accounts, the detritus of piety and village committees. Dust puffed up as he shifted them aside. His eyes stung and he coughed. Someone ought to have cleared all this out years ago. At the bottom of a box labelled Charity 1980-1995, he found the Kirk accounts, paper so thin it nearly tore when he turned it. The years around McIver's death were there, collections, disbursements, a few petty notes about hall repairs. Nothing unusual until a folded sheet slipped free and fell to the floor. Hamish picked it up. Farrow's handwriting, firmer, younger. "To the session. I ask again why no report was made of the vehicle damage associated with the McIver accident. Registration noted, RM, car belonging to Mr. Rory McPhee. Please advise why no statement was taken. No reply attached." Hamish stood there, holding the paper that had never been answered, never been filed, never been shown to anyone except, perhaps, the very men who wanted it forgotten. He felt a hollow disappointment settle in his chest. He had written to Daviot only days ago, calling Rory a man of integrity, a fine judge he was turning out to be. Lugs nosed the door then, the faintest scratch. Hamish let him in. The dog padded straight to his side, but kept glancing upward, unsettled by the smell of old dust and something harsher, burnt paper lingering on Hamish's jacket. "Aye," Hamish said quietly, not sure whether he meant it for the dog or himself. "I should have known." He sat on a low wooden chair meant for Sunday school children and read the note again. Farrow had come once before, years ago. He had asked questions. He'd been ignored. He came back now, more determined, and ended up floating in the loch. And Rory McPhee, respected Kirk elder, smooth talker, widower's benefactor, sat squarely in the centre of it. Lugs lay down at Hamish's feet, ears drooping. The dog didn't cross Rory's yard tonight. Animals didn't know evidence, but they knew the smell of fires recently fed. Hamish folded the note, put it in his coat, and looked around the dim hall. Shut doors everywhere. Doors closed against questions, against him, against the truth. Outside, the mist pressed low, muting the village into silence. Rory McPhee had once seemed the safe man to trust, the respectable shield Hamish had leaned on. Now Hamish felt the weight of that trust dragging him down like a stone. He locked the hall behind him, though it barely mattered, and walked back with Lugs close at his heel. The village lay still, but he knew it wasn't peace. It was waiting, dark, tight-lipped waiting. He felt it in the air, in the wet earth, in himself. Everything had shifted, and he had backed the wrong man. Hamish knew something was wrong the minute he stepped onto the pavement outside Patel's shop. 2 schoolgirls stood by the window pretending to read the notice board, but their eyes slid towards him with that quick, bright interest that meant gossip had already won its race. The wind off the loch slapped cold against his face, but it was the mutters that chilled him more. By the time he reached the back door, Lugs trotting close, he could hear voices inside. Too many for a private meeting. He had asked only Rory McPhee to come. Clearly that had been wishful thinking. Nothing in Lochdu ever stayed quiet, not when it might grow legs and run. Patel opened the door with an expression that managed to be both polite and annoyed. "Constable," he said stiffly. They were all passing. Hamish stepped into the cramped storeroom. The light flickered overhead. Boxes of tea, tinned goods, and an old heater crowded the walls. And there they were. Sinclair leaning on a crate, pretending calm. Mrs. Ross with her arms folded tight across her chest. Patel hovering near the shelves as if ready to reclaim his shop at any moment. A young crofter Hamish barely recognised. And Priscilla, cool as winter frost, standing by the door like she'd been carved there. Rory McPhee sat in the sole wooden chair, hands folded on his lap, the picture of wounded dignity. "You wanted to see me, Macbeth," he said, mild and patient, as though Hamish were a child making a fuss. Hamish had planned to be gentle. Now, staring at them all squeezed into the room like fish in a tin, he felt the whole thing sliding out of his hands. Still, he took out the wrapped evidence from his coat pocket and laid it on a wooden crate. "That came out of your ditch, Rory," he said. "Burned photograph. Car with a dented wing. Lochdu signpost behind it, marked as evidence in McIver's accident." Rory blinked slowly. "Anyone could have put rubbish in my ditch. Folk toss all sorts of things away." "And this," Hamish added, placing the folded paper beside it, "is a note Farrow wrote to the Kirk session years ago, asking about your car's damage, asking why no statement was taken." The temperature in the small room shifted. Mrs. Ross's fingers drummed her arm, agitated. Patel stared at the wall. Sinclair's smile went thin. Mrs. Ross was the first to snap. "Aye, well, I always wondered," she said suddenly, voice cracking. "My man was killed, and the Kirk had a collection ready the same week. Too generous by half. What were you buying, Rory? Silence?" Rory straightened, affronted. "I helped you, woman. I did what was right. There's gratitude for you." "You helped yourself more," Patel muttered, low but not low enough. "The farmers always do." Sinclair, cheeks reddening, jabbed a thumb towards Hamish. "And what about him? Blair nearly had my licence pulled because of this circus. Perhaps the constable should apologise to me for once." Hamish felt the walls closing in. The room had become a hive, stinging at random. Priscilla spoke without moving from the door. "If you all wish to shout over each other, do go on, but it will not change what's on that paper." Her tone was cool, distant, satisfied in its disappointment. Rory pressed a hand dramatically to his chest. "I helped every soul in this room one time or another. All I ever did was try to look after the village. And now Macbeth turns his back on me. Is that it?" A murmured wave of agreement rippled among the onlookers. Lochdu loved its tidy lines of loyalty, even when they were crooked. Lugs lay flat on the floor, ears pinned to his skull as the shouting rose again. Patel snapped at Sinclair. Sinclair barked at Mrs. Ross, and somewhere in the middle Rory began shaking his head, saintly and wronged. Hamish felt heat creep up his neck. All week he had been pushed. Blair, Daviot, villagers, even Priscilla's silent judgment. Now they wanted him to play referee to their grudges. He slammed his palm on the crate. The room jerked still. Enough. They stared. Even Luggs lifted his head. Hamish heard his own voice, harsher than he meant, but the words came anyway, blunt and heavy. "Someone in this room killed Colin Farrow," he said, "and someone in this room drove a car over Donald McIver and left him to die." The silence after that was thick enough to choke on. Then it broke all at once, Mrs. Ross shouting that she'd known it, Patel demanding to know why his family was dragged into this, Sinclair sputtering that Hamish had no right, the crofter muttering accusations old enough to smell of mould. Rory rose from his chair, trembling with outrage. "You filthy slanderer," he whispered, "after all I've done." Hamish felt Priscilla's eyes on him, but did not look her way. He had lost the room, he had lost the village, and not one of them was going to confess a thing. He stepped back, opened the door, and let the noise spill into the corridor like steam from a cracked pipe. Luggs bolted out first. Outside, the street had gone dark. The cold stung his face again, sharper than before. Behind him, the shouting faded to dull argument. Priscilla appeared at the threshold, pale and expressionless. For a moment he thought she might say something, but she only looked at him the way people looked at broken things they had once thought sturdy. Then she turned inside and shut the door. Hamish stood there, feeling Lochdu turning against him, slow and sure as the tide. He walked back to the station with Luggs padding close, neither of them eager to meet the eyes of townsfolk peering from behind curtains. He had no confession, no support, and no way forward that didn't risk making everything worse. But the mess inside Patel's back room was only the beginning. Someone there had trembled at the wrong moment, someone had flushed too red, and someone, he was certain, was already planning their next lie. He felt it in the cold air, in the quiet street, in himself. The village had turned, and now he had to find the truth alone. The summons from Daviot came before Hamish had even finished scraping frost from the station kettle. The message was curt: authorize a reconstruction, tidy it up. When senior officers wanted tidying, it meant they were afraid. Hamish set down the kettle and swore under his breath. Luggs looked up, ears twitching at the tone. Luggs dragged him back to the peat stack, whining. Hamish dug with numb fingers and pulled free a half-burned brown envelope, brittle with scorch marks. The address, Smith & Doyle, Solicitors, Glasgow, was still just legible. By afternoon, the whole miserable party stood at the lock edge like a group waiting for a bus that would never come. Mist hung low and wet, the kind that simply existed rather than trying to look dramatic. The rocks were slick. Hamish noted a few villagers watching from the road, pretending they were only out for a walk. Blair arrived last, puffing, Anderson flapping behind him. "Right," Blair barked, as if this had all been his idea. "Let's get this rubbish over with." Rory McPhee stood apart from the group, jacket zipped right to his chin. His eyes darted around, not quite meeting Hamish's. Mrs. Ross hovered stiffly, her hands working at the strap of her bag. Patel kept his distance from her and from Sinclair, each man nursing slights not yet fully aired. Tam McNab, sullen, mud still on his cuffs from the cell, looked ready to kick someone. Priscilla watched from a few steps back, pale and remote. Hamish started without ceremony. "Farrow posted an envelope that night. That can't be argued." He kept his voice flat. No one here deserved embellishment. He walked from Patel's shop along this road. He visited Mrs. Ross. Then he came back along the road with his attaché case. Blair snorted loudly. Or he wandered about drunk. He was sober, Hamish said, not rising to Blair's bait. And he was looking for answers. He took the half-burned photograph from his pocket. The damp air had curled it slightly overnight. This was in Rory's ditch. Photograph of a car with a dented wing. Signpost, Lochdu 2 miles. Label says McIver accident. Evidence. Rory shook his head, slow and pitying. As I said before, Macbeth, folk toss rubbish anywhere. Mrs. Ross stepped forward. Her voice cracked. My Donald wasn't rubbish. Rory's mouth tightened, but he said nothing. Hamish produced the old note Farrow had sent the Kirk session years back. This is Farrow asking why no statement was taken from the owner of the damaged car. He kept his tone neutral. Owner being you, Rory. Patel muttered. He lies neat as a sermon. Blair cleared his throat loudly, trying to regain authority. I was already considering McPhee, he said, waving a hand. No one acknowledged him. Hamish reached for the last pieces. A sealed evidence bag held the charred, crumpled envelope retrieved that morning. This, he said, is the envelope Farrow posted, found under Rory's peat stack. A sharp intake of breath passed through the small crowd. Even Tam looked startled. Hamish held it up. Address still clear. Smith and Doyle, Glasgow. Burn mark same as the photograph. Someone took it from the postbox and tried to destroy it, Sinclair muttered. We're all fools then, every one of us. Mrs. Ross turned on Rory fully now. Did you run my Donald down and leave him? Did you? Rory lifted his chin. I helped you, all of you, and this is the thanks. Answer her, Hamish said. A long silence followed. Mist drifted around them like damp wool. Lugs lay low again, ears flat as tension thickened the air. When Rory finally spoke, his voice had none of its usual mildness. Something brittle had cracked beneath it. He wouldn't listen, he said. That Englishman, he came here years ago, stirring trouble, and then he came again. His hand trembled as he jabbed a finger toward the rocks. He wouldn't leave it alone, wouldn't leave me alone. Blair straightened as if he had solved the case himself. So you're admitting it, then? Rory ignored him. I tried to stop him. He pushed past, waving his damned case. I grabbed him, that's all. He slipped, hit his head, fell in. His voice rose. He was never meant to stay. Same as McIver. Folk who don't understand should keep to their own roads. Mrs. Ross flinched. Patel shook his head slowly. The young crofter beside him muttered something dark under his breath. And the letter? Hamish asked quietly. You burned that too? Rory pressed shaking hands against his temples. I did what anyone would do to protect a good name. Your own, Sinclair said acidly. The confession came in jagged pieces, but it was enough. Blair puffed up, ordering Anderson to take Rory into custody, though Anderson seemed more nervous than triumphant. Mrs. Ross turned away, shoulders shaking once before she hid it. The others drifted back towards the road, silent, embarrassed, hungry for distance. By the time the last of them had gone, the mist had thinned to a mild drizzle. Later, much later, Tam McNab would be cleared. Patel's shop would see customers again. Sinclair would stop threatening to write to the licensing board, and the paper would print a dull, forgettable line about local man charged in historic case. But none of that mattered now. Back in the small station, Hamish crouched by the peat fire, poked it into reluctant life, and poured tea into a chipped mug. Lug snored softly on the rug, twitching as if chasing rabbits in a happier world. Hamish sat back in the rickety chair and stared at the steam rising from his cup. People came to Lochdu all the time. Tourists, wanderers, officials. Some left nothing behind. Some left trouble. Farrow hadn't meant to stay. Rory had made sure of it. Hamish let the thought drift away like the last curl of steam and reached for the next petty complaint on his desk. The work never stopped, scandal or not, and Lochdu, quiet for now, would never thank him for uncovering its secrets.